Hey guys, I'm Citizen Kannot and I'm here with Neonvice in my home studio, which consists of my stuff in my bedroom. I'm gonna show you guys how I produce stuff, what I use to produce stuff, and we're gonna take a look at a track called Kevlar, which is just being released. It's going to be released at the same time as this video. So if you're not a Patreon contributor and you haven't gotten it sooner, because this track is going to be available sooner for Patreon contributors, then I really think you should go to the link in the description of the video and listen to the track first in my SoundCloud, because then you're gonna know everything that we're gonna be talking about here. And yeah, let's go.
Alright, tell us a little bit about your equipment.
I am inside the box kind of producer. I don't have hardware at all. I have a set of monitors, the KRK's Rocket 5 3rd generation. I just got them like a month ago. Before that, I spent my entire life mixing and producing with Apple earphones. So working with these guys now is like so easy. It's just like a new universe of frequencies. And I use an M-Audio, very simple interface just to connect the monitors to the computer, and an Akai MPK Mini, which is made of plastic. It looks like a toy, feels like a toy, but it has velocity sensitiveness and it does its job. I'm not Mozart, I don't play symphonies, I don't need a huge piano. Usually I compose like bass lines and synth lines with my guitar because I'm a guitar player and bass player. So I don't need like a huge synth or piano or MIDI controller to compose stuff. So, and I use MacBook. I'm from the Mac team. That's it. Let's not get into this argument.
Alright, you wanna take a look at the track now?
Yes, so in this track I try to do like a tribal thing. I'm into that right now. I've always been into mixing synthwave with different stuff, but this tribal influence comes from Retrohands, which is an electro duo that I'm a huge fan of. So if you maybe are watching it, shout out to Retrohands because I love you guys. Your sound is awesome.
We're gonna have a description in the bottom as well.
Yeah, exactly. You're gonna have a link there. So I was listening to a lot of Retrohands and I was like, yeah, I should. And their latest album has this kind of tribal thing, like as if you're in the middle of the jungle and stuff. Very nice. And I was like, yeah, I should mix that with synthwave, you know, with more kind of retro sounds. I don't know. And well, that's the result. So as I said in the interview last episode, I usually start a track from the beginning. That's it. And I knew I wanted to start this one with a rhythm to give it the tone already, like not to waste too much time like with an intro, how is this gonna sound? No, it just starts with a beat and you already understand what the track is all about. It's a tribal, heavier sounding percussion kind of thing. So it starts straight with the rhythm, with the different samples I used. To create the rhythm side of my tracks, I use waveforms, I use audio tracks instead of MIDI. I used to work with Ableton's drum rack. I'm using Ableton obviously, and then work with the percussion side of things using drum rack, using MIDI files, but I just found out to be easier to look at the track and know what's going on already. It's just something I got used to, and I sample all of my sounds. I'm not into creating your own drum sounds, with drums obviously, with synths of course not, but with drums I just have drums sample packs, and whatever I need I can find there. I know my sample packs very well, and for example this percussion sound, which consists of three different sounds, I got it from a Retrohands sample pack. You just had to like their Facebook page and you could download a free sample pack. So thanks once again Retrohands for the inspiration and the samples. And this is a loop, and that reminds me of loops.
From our previous episode.
Our previous episodes, because Axel is always making fun of it because we're always discussing loops. And loops are not a bad thing. I don't think they're a bad thing. I never use loops like entire loops, like, oh, that sounds nice, boom, and I put it in my track. But what I do is like, oh, this loop has nice sounds in it. So I just chop the loop and I use the samples, I use, well, the sounds inside the loop to recreate a new rhythm or a new pattern, it doesn't matter. So this Retro Hands sample pack, this was a loop, and it had a completely different rhythm. I just chopped the sounds in it and I recreated the loop with my own idea. I just start knocking on my table until something nice comes up, and that's pretty much it. So when it comes to drums, usually my mix is very simple. I just use a compressor, reverb when needed, and equalizer, and they are all very simple. For example, this time I use reverb on the kick, and I can hear a lot of people going nuts. You use reverb on the kick? Oh my god! Nothing wrong with it, seriously. It's not a rule. Many people think that there are such thing as rules. It's not a rule. Sometimes it just sounds nice. It's a very simple and subtle reverb just to give a little bit of ambience. There's nothing wrong with it. And with compression, I always use the Cakewalk CA2A type compressor. Very simple compressor, because there's no such thing as a simple compression. It's the hardest thing to get a hang of when we're talking about mixing. But it has just two knobs with gain and peak reduction, gain reduction, and that's it. This compressor, it gives a little bit of warmth at the same time that it doesn't have a very fast attack. So it just brings up that low end of your kick, in this case, for example. But I use it for everything. The percussion, you see the same thing. When it comes to equalizing, I just make sure that I'm bringing the best frequencies of that sound up and cutting important frequencies of other sounds. That's it. So for example, here, the kick, of course, it has a lot of low end to it. Here, obviously, I just boosted up a little bit at 93 Hertz. So what I did with the percussion track, I just removed everything from 100 Hertz up, because there was no need to do it for it to be there. And I boosted around 2200 Hertz in the percussion. So it's like a little bit of a puzzle. You just start like, okay, so these frequencies are important for this sound and these other frequencies are for this sound. So you just start fitting everything in its own place. And sometimes you have to change your sound. Sometimes, okay, I cannot use this synth, I cannot use this sample because it's just fighting against that other sound. So you just have to go there and put an octave higher or something like that. It happens a lot. So after this intro with the percussion, and you come to this break. Oh, sorry. You come to this break, which brings in the more synthy kind of part of the track. 4 different synthesizers doing 4 different sounds. This little reverberated first sound, and then other sounds come in. I wanted to show this one that comes here by the end of the break. This plucky sound, because I love it. I use it a lot. It's an influence from prog house, some of my older influences, deadmau5. I'm a huge fan of deadmau5, and he uses that kind of sound a lot. At least he used to. So it's this sound. It's Aspire the synth. I really like this synth. You can do a lot of stuff with it. In this case, it's very simple. It's 2 oscillators, oscillator 1 and 2, with saw waves, and then a inflector filter. It's a specific type of filter that Aspire has, with an envelope on the cutoff of the filter. So it just gives it this plucky kind of sound. If you make the decay longer, it's obviously gonna be less plucky, less tabby, with less transients and stuff. but I love using that sound, very simple sound, to make it, you can probably emulate it with any synth of your choice. Under here you have another Spire, making this kind of brass. It's very simple as well. This time it's only one oscillator with a simple saw wave, with another envelope in the cutoff as well, with a longer decay. Anyway, it's a different filter as well. This time it's Perfecto instead of Infecto, but that's just like technical stuff from this specific plugin. It's not worth it, and it just gives it this brassy feel, this longer decay on the envelope, and so we have this break, and then you come back. You come back to the rhythm part together with the synths. When it comes to mixing them, it's the same thing. For example, in this first sound, which is that pad on Tyrell, it's got a lot of lower frequencies, and that's taking care of the low frequencies of the synth group. So you can see here in the spectrum, I use a multiband compressor to compress the low frequencies, because that's something I learned while working with those for such a long time, that I couldn't hear the low frequencies, the mid-low frequencies on those fellas that well. So all the time that I would listen to my tracks after mastering in like bigger speakers, I would see that the low frequencies, the mid-low, were going nuts, like all over the place. So I learned the hard way to compress as much as I could, in a way, the low frequencies of my sounds, of those sounds that had low frequencies, of course. So here I use a multiband dynamics compressor to compress, 2 dB of gain reduction in the low frequencies of the sound. EQ, the same thing. You can see here that at exactly 93 Hz I have a huge dip. That's because, as we've seen before, 93 Hz is exactly the best frequency of my kick, and since they're both in the low part of the spectrum, I don't want their frequencies to battle against each other. So I just cut abruptly the 93 Hz from this low sound, because I want my kick to stand up. Then I have the CH8 again to compress it, and I use the Ableton compressor to work as a sidechain compression. What I do, which most people don't do, is I don't use the kick track as the input, as to say, in the compression that's being used for the sidechain. I create a second track, which I call Ghost Track, that follows the same rhythm, the same pattern as the kick. As you can see here, it follows the same pattern with a different sample, it doesn't matter. And I leave this track, this Ghost Track, turned off, and it's not playing anything. If I solo it, you're gonna listen to it, but if I remove the solo, it's not gonna be playing, as you can see here. I just use it as a reference for the sidechain compression, because sometimes I don't want the sounds to be compressed in the sidechain in the same shape as my kick sample. Sometimes I just want a little bit of compression in the transient or in the low end, it doesn't matter. So I use a separate track, and I route this track to the sidechain, as you can see here. Sidechain audio from Ghost, so it's gonna be following the Ghost pattern. And then a utility, that's something I learned not that long ago. I was like, hey, this utility, what does it do? And I found out that it does magic. When it comes to, because even though you work with equalizers and you put every frequency in its own place, you have to remember that you're working with a stereo field, so utility is very good to widen or not your sounds, etc. So yeah, so we have this part of the music, and then each synth has its own equalizer settings. You can see that, with the exception of the first one, all of them I use a cutoff in the equalizer to cut the low frequencies. It's very important that the low frequencies in your track come from a single source, or in this case, two sources: the kick and the bassy synth. Okay, then so after this part, you have this second break, which is a little bit heavier. I wanted to do that because I was listening to Urban Force's new EP back then, and I just fell in love with it. And the first track, I forgot the name of the track, I just fell in love with it, and it was so heavy, and I loved it, and I was like, hey man, I loved your EP, I loved your track. And I was starting to produce this track at the same time, and I wanted to have a heavy kind of break in this track. Even though it was not needed in a way, I wanted to put that in the track. So I gave it this little break, which has this dark pad, that's how I called it, and I made it with Massive. And Massive is, for me, by far, to me, is the best plugin synth ever. Like, you cannot find a better. Oh, I love Juno, I love the Minimoog, they are all awesome, but when it comes to a complete synth, like if you find something that you cannot do with Massive, I'll give you a trophy, because it's got everything. Many times I talk about simple synths, but it doesn't mean that they are simple. Like, you can do infinite stuff with simple synthesizers, with just a saw and a square wave. You can do a bunch of stuff with them. But Massive has like dozens of synth forms, of waveforms, and that's unbelievable. And I'm not saying you need fancy stuff to produce music. I really not saying that. I used to produce music with earphones, with Apple earphones for a couple of years. Probably the track or the tracks that you listen from me were produced with those. So I'm not saying that you need fancy big plugins or hardware. I'm completely against that. But what I'm trying to say is that Massive gives you a lot of options. And since it's the first synth that I worked with my production life, I got very used to it. So even though it has like dozens of different waveforms, I kind of know what all of them do in a way, you know? So for this pad, for example, I use two different waveforms. One of them is called Melancholia, and the other one is called Mellowphant, in two different octaves, with a low-pass filter with an LFO routing to the cutoff of the filter, just to give a little bit of movement. Very simple, but it sounds different. It sounds like you listen to it and you go like, but what is this sound? It's not a saw wave. It's not, what's that waveform? And that's what Massive does. I have no idea how is a Melancholia waveform shaped. It's just different, and that's why I love Massive, because once you get the hang of it, it looks very complex, but it's not after a while. You just can literally do anything you want with it. So that's why I love Massive. And in this break I also used this heavier bass ARP sound. For this sound I used OBXD, which is what I would call a simple synthesizer. As I said, it's not that you cannot do much with it. You can do a lot of stuff with it. But, for example, this one only has two oscillators with a saw and a pulse wave for you to choose from. Awesome. Brilliant. I love it. I'm using it. Of course I love it. But you can see the difference, you know, some synths are better for this kind of thing and others are better for this. I could make this sound on Massive, but why if I have OBXD, which is another synth that I use a lot, and I know how it works, and sometimes you don't know what sound you're looking for, and that's when I use Massive most of the time, because it gives you so many options that I just start like messing around with it and I find something I like. When I know what I want, as in this case for example, I just opened OBXD. I knew it was a saw wave kind of ARP, just opened it, I just did what I wanted to do, and that was it. So it's quite a simple sound, but then here comes Trash. And Trash is for me one of the most important tools that I use, because every synth sound, almost every synth sound that I create, I add Trash afterwards, because this thing became as important as the synthesizer when I come up with a sound. I'm not kidding, because this is not the best example. I'm gonna show you guys how it sounds without trash. It sounds like this. And when I add trash, it's got a lot more of harmonics, high harmonics, it's wider, it's brighter, and that's not the best example, because what I did here was kind of simple saturation, because it lets you do that. But sometimes you want to go nuts, and it just gives you that option as well. You have like many different saturation types here. You have in different groups like distort, drive, etc. You can control the drive, you can control the gain, the mix, the shape, the filter of the saturation you're adding to your sound, and then you come to Convolve, which is my favorite tool, which allows you to emulate different places where your sound could be coming from, which is nuts. You can emulate like amp sounds, and you can emulate, like here for example, you have like in devices you have like loose snare, metal barrel. You can emulate like as if your sound was coming out of one of those things, and it just completely changes your sound. Sometimes I create something in a synth, a massive inspire, whatever, and I add trash later on, and I completely change from scratch how the synth is sounding. So I love using trash. I do that a lot, and that Convolve option allows you to work with the widening your sound as well. So yeah, trash is very important in my process. So after this break is done, which consists of this bass arc and this dark pad, and it's giving up already. Okay, we come back to the smoother sounds, which are once again that plucky kind of sound. This time is the same sound as before, but now as an arc, and then the original sound comes back. And here you can see like after I finished the track, I was like, oh man, that's very close to Dead Mouse, because this right here, this it sounds a lot like one of his tracks, which I couldn't remember which one. I have to find it, so if one of you know what I'm talking about, just let me know, because I'm looking for that track. And then you come to this final stage of the track, which is basically all the instruments together to wrap up the track. That's pretty much it. When it comes to effects, I use samples, like simple effects like white noise, crashes, that kind of stuff, white noise build-ups, etc. I use samples. I know how to make white noise with a synth with operator from Ableton, for example. Just create white noise and then add phaser, chorus, reverb, any kind of processing you want, and a sidechain compression, and there you go. But I won't waste my time doing it. Like, it's gonna take like what, 5-10 minutes to make something really interesting. I know how to make it, but if I have in my library sounds that are already made, I'm just gonna use them. And usually I just use like very simple EQ, and then the tracks are frozen because the computer is going nuts with all those things going on, the recording and shit. And something I use a lot as well is like return tracks. Ableton lets you use return tracks, but what I usually do is I add an audio effect track, and in order not to lose the dry signal of the sound. Sometimes you want to add reverb, for example, without losing the dry signal. You want to keep 100% dry and plus the reverb, instead of giving up a little bit of dry to get a little bit of wet. That sounds awful, doesn't it? In the snare, for example, I wanted to keep the dry signal, the clean signal, so I add an audio effect rack and I create a chain called clean, which has no processing in it, and I create a second chain called reverb. In this case it's a reverb, and I add the reverb in the second chain and I put it 100% wet. Therefore I keep the completely dry signal and I can add reverb as much as I want, just controlling its gain. Yeah, and then just to finish the master part of my production, I use once again the CA2A from Cakewalk to compress, to glue everything together. A lot of people, usually very young producers, they don't understand what does it mean to glue your music together. Because as I said in the beginning, the compression is something very hard to really understand and to train your ears to listen to it and understand what it's doing to the sound. It's very hard. So I feel your pain when you go like, what is that? What is gluing your sound together? It just makes everything, you know, your track stops sounding like a bunch of instruments and different sounds put together, and they sound like a unique, solid thing. Because what it does, it brings like those low sounding sounds a little bit up, and it smashes the sound a tiny bit, as you can see here in this track, in this master for example. Wait, there you go. It has like less than 1 dB of gain reduction, but it already makes a big difference. And as I said before, this compressor, it gives a little bit of warmth, so it gives a little bit of body to your sound. And I always use this compressor before going to Ozone 6, which is just, I don't have words for this plugin. It has everything you need for mastering in a single place. You have equalizer, dynamics, exciter, imager, and maximizer, and a dynamic EQ, but I don't use it. So when it comes to equalizing, I always cut a little bit of the very low frequencies, like 29 Hz in this case for example, and basically I just crank a little bit up, like from 2K up. I don't use presets for mastering, I never do. Not even for tryouts or anything, because I feel that every track sounds amazingly different than the other. And in the master stage, you're working with the entire track at the same time, all its elements together. That even if you're looking for the same result at the end for an EP, for a CD for example, everything has to sound the same way, the same kind of feeling. Still, the things you're gonna have to do on each track to reach the final unique result, they're gonna be so different, because every track is very different. That's my opinion. So I never use presets when it comes to mastering. I use multiband dynamics. I compress a lot of the very low frequencies, and then also with the mids, I just compress with a big ratio. In this case it's like 5.2 to 1. Once again, that's from back at the time when I used to work with earphones. I couldn't listen to those mid-low frequencies very well, so I would compress them a little bit further, so to make sure that they weren't going all over the place. An exciter, tape exciter, because well, it's brighter than most different types of saturation. You have tube, triode, retro, warm. I use tape most of the time because I like the sound of the tape saturation. As many people do nowadays, it's very en vogue. And then imager, just to focus the lower sounds in the very center of your image, your stereo image, and widen up a little bit the higher frequencies. And the maximizer, which is just a limiter. The maximizer limiter in Ozone 6 is amazing. You can go, when I was using it for the first time and I was like, man, I'm going further than I usually go, but it still sounds good. It's very good limiter. I totally would say for you to try this plugin out. And yeah, that's it. Wow. What else? Okay, so yeah, so that was it. Thanks a lot for you who've watched it. Thanks a lot to Retro Hands for the inspiration and the samples. To deadmau5, to Irving Force, because all of you were a little bit of a part of this track. And yeah, and don't forget to check the track out in the description. So yeah, what else? I think that's it, right? And thanks Axel, because you're so cute. And thanks to Neonvice, obviously, and to everybody who's watched it. So, yep.
Alright guys, for verbal thank yous, we've got VHS Dreams, Claudio Mariani, Logan Sky, Tag Drummond, and Theo. Thank you all for your support, and hope you enjoy it.